They say that on the morning of October 11th, 1851, the auctioneer at Court Square reached for his bell, and before the metal could strike, every bird on the wires above him suddenly took flight. Witnesses later described it as a signal, as though the entire city of Memphis shuddered at the same invisible command. But no one could explain why the crowd fell silent before the bell even rang, or why their attention snapped toward the far end of the platform, where a single young man stood barefoot in iron shackles. His name, or at least the name he had been given, was Jonas. His crime was never recorded. His origin was deliberately erased. Yet everyone present, slave traders, bankers, wives, even children, claimed they felt something dreadful the instant they saw him. Not beauty, not sympathy, but recognition, as though he resembled someone they knew, someone they feared, someone long gone. Days later, when the bill of sale vanished, when Jonas himself disappeared without a trace, and when the courthouse clerk who recorded the transaction was found drowned in just 2 feet of water, city officials sealed the records. Ministers refused to speak his name. Newspapers printed nothing. For more than a century, the event survived only as a fever dream from a city rotting with guilt. But decades later, in the archives of an abandoned seminary, investigators discovered one journal, one missing ledger page, and one unsigned confession. Together they reveal a truth. Memphis tried to bury the story of a man who should never have been sold, who should never have existed on 1851. Memphis stood on the fault line between old plantations and the expanding industrial world. Cotton money gorged the streets while epidemics hollowed them out. Churches tightened control over their congregations. Doctors catalogued bodies the way merchants catalogued crates. In this landscape of profit and fear, enslaved people were converted into ledgers, measurements, and approximations, not individuals, but assessed units. But Jonas defied that categorization from the moment he appeared. Slave traders prided themselves on their ability to determine a man's age, strength, and origin at a glance. Yet none could place him. Some argued he was mixed race. Others insisted he was foreign-born. One described him as too symmetrical, which, in the language of the day, meant suspiciously flawless, a sign of fabrication, fraud, or something unnatural. What troubled the traders most was not Jonas himself, but the paperwork accompanying him. His transport manifest was incomplete. His previous owner's signature was missing. His age line was smudged out, but not by time, by design. Worse still, his intake number 1481 did not exist in the courthouse's registry. It jumped directly from 1480 to 1482. Officials blamed clerical error. Historians blamed sloppy bookkeeping. But in the margins of an 1851 seminary notebook, someone else blamed something far more unsettling. 1481 was not an error. It was a replacement, and the original 1481 was never meant to be seen. Again, the seminary responsible for processing enslaved people, brought through Memphis, was run by a council of ministers who insisted on moral supervision of transactions. In practice, this meant they catalogued bodies under the guise of righteousness. They kept 2 sets of records, the public ledgers and the confidential indices, where they evaluated obedience, temperament, and spiritual malleability. Jonas appeared only in the confidential book. His description was unlike any other. Entry: Jonas, estimated mid-20s, no birthplace, no scars, no dialect markers, stands silent, responds only with a look I cannot endure. Below it, written in a shaking hand, do not let him pass through the orphanage. That line raised suspicion among later investigators. Why would a grown man be rooted anywhere near an orphanage? Why would the seminary's clergy fear him crossing paths with children? Historians speculate it ties to Memphis's shadow network of training homes, where enslaved children were raised to suppress memory and identity, a system the seminary oversaw. Jonas's presence threatened that system, though no one could explain why. One surviving witness, interviewed in 19, recalled seeing Jonas stare at a group of children outside the seminary gates. She said the children froze, then all simultaneously burst into tears without him speaking a word. She remembered his expression as he watched them, not sorrow, not pity, but recognition again, as though he had seen them before. The man who delivered Jonas to Memphis was Elias Brood, a mid-tier slave trader known for dealing in special acquisitions. Brood kept meticulous measurements, medical notes, but when investigators reviewed his ledgers, they found a gap spanning exactly 3 weeks. That 3-week void corresponded to Jonas's transport. Brood's descendants later turned over one surviving letter he wrote during that period. It contained only one line: I am bringing a man who has no beginning. I fear what will follow if he is given an end. Brood vanished 2 months after Jonas's disappearance. His body was never found, but a steamboat captain claimed to have seen someone resembling Brood wandering along the Mississippi levee at dawn, moody, barefoot, mumbling a single phrase over and over: he remembers us. He remembers everything. Researchers long assumed hallucination, but Brood had been a strictly practical man. No drinking, no fever, no recorded delusions. So what had Brood seen on the journey? What had Jonas said or shown that erased 3 weeks of documentation and shattered the trader's mind? The steamboat crew recalled one incident. Jonas broke his chains during a night storm but made no attempt to flee. Instead, he stood in the rain, looking toward the dark woods, whispering something no one could decipher, not begging, not threatening, something closer to naming, as though he recognized someone standing there. In the trees, someone no one else could see. Among the few first-hand accounts was a testimony from Adele Harrow, the wife of a judge known for attending public auctions. Unlike others, she never once looked directly at Jonas. Instead, she kept her gaze fixed on the ground, hands trembling violently. When questioned decades later, she said, "If I had looked at him, I would have known him, and if I had known him, I would have remembered something I have spent my entire life trying to forget." She refused to elaborate, but her granddaughter later found a note hidden behind one of Adele's portrait frames. "The face of the man on the platform is the same face I saw in the orphanage cellar when I was 7 years old. He has not aged." This created an impossible contradiction. Jonas was a grown man in 1851. Adele would have been a child decades earlier. The orphanage she referenced was one with deep ties to the institution, eventually shuttered for unsanctioned psychological correction experiments on enslaved children. No photographs of those children remain. Their names were replaced by numbers, and yet Adele's cryptic confession implied Jonas shared a face with one of them and changed by time. Historians dismiss her claim as trauma-induced delusion. But if Adele invented the memory, why did she refuse to look at him even as an adult? Why did she insist that one moment of eye contact would force her to remember the cellar? And what exactly had happened beneath that orphanage, the one whose blueprints later revealed a hidden room that did not appear on any official design? When the abandoned orphanage was surveyed in the 1920s, workers found a door bricked over behind the furnace. The room beyond had no official entry, no windows, and no ventilation. Inside they found only three things: a rusted chain bolted to the floor, a pile of identical children's shoes, and a message carved repeatedly into the wood in different handwritings. "Don't look at him." The handwriting varied in height, pressure, and slant, indicating children of different ages had carved it. What were they warning each other about? Why would looking at one individual be dangerous? And how did this tie to Jonas, the man Adele Harrow claimed not to look at? Investigators discovered that the orphanage had once operated a memory correction program, where children were isolated for days, forced to recite new identities until they forgot their previous ones. But a letter from the orphanage matron hinted at an unspeakable failure. There is one among them who remembers everything the other children forget, and when they see him, they remember too. This must not continue. Was this one a child, a myth, or somehow the same person decades later? No child's file matched Jonas's adult description, but several files had been wiped: birth dates, ages, family origins replaced with nothing but a number. One number in particular had been crossed out so violently it tore the paper. 1481. The day Jonas arrived at Court Square, he was scheduled for an immediate sale. Yet before his auction slot, he vanished from the holding yard. Guards swore he never passed through the gates. Witnesses insisted he hadn't climbed the fence, but the iron shackles found on the ground were cold, as though they had been removed hours earlier. A search party combed the alleys but found no trace, until a child from the orphanage, a boy of 9, was discovered wandering barefoot near the river, shivering, repeating the same sentence: "He remembered me." This incident was logged but suppressed. Orphanage children were not permitted to interact with enslaved adults, and certainly not escape the grounds. The boy died 2 days later of what doctors called spontaneous heart failure, a rare diagnosis for a child. His burial record was signed by a seminary official, one who later left a brief confession in his diary: "I saw the man they called Jonas. The child knew him, but the timeline is wrong. The years are wrong. The face is wrong." After several hours, Jonas reappeared in the auction yard without explanation. No guard had seen him return. His clothes were dry despite an earlier rain. He showed no fatigue, no fear, no marks of restraint or escape. The auctioneer insisted the sale continue, but during the inspection, another anomaly surfaced. Jonas's pulse was slow, unnaturally slow. One physician recorded it as 32 beats per minute. Others insisted they could not locate a pulse at all. When asked his age, Jonas remained silent. When asked his birthplace, silent. When asked if he understood English, he nodded once. That nod unsettled the crowd more than any speech might have, because multiple witnesses later confirmed that his expression changed subtly, not into fear or anger, but into something more devastating: resignation, as though he had lived through this moment many times before. During the sale, when the courthouse clerk stepped forward to finalize paperwork, he froze mid-sentence, staring at Jonas with terror. He whispered, "It's him," then fled the platform. That clerk was found dead 2 days later, drowned in 2 feet of water, arms locked in a defensive position. The coroner reported no struggle, no signs of seizure, no alcohol in his system. His final written note: "I know that face. I saw it when I was a child, but it has not aged." 3 different adults from different decades claimed Jonas resembled someone from their childhood, yet all 3 would have been children at different times. How could one face appear across generations unchanged? The seminary, desperate to bury the scandal, issued an official statement claiming Jonas was merely a foreign-born indentured worker incorrectly processed, but their private memoranda tell a different story. One internal letter between clergy reads, "He is not new, he is returned." Another says, "We erased him once, we must do it again." These cryptic lines suggest Jonas had some prior connection to the seminary, possibly through the orphanage system. He may have been one of the unregistered children placed in the program, stripped of identity, and reassigned. But such children would have grown older. Their faces would have changed. Their bodies would have marked time. Jonas's did not. A historian reviewing the letters concluded, the seminary feared not what Jonas was, but what he remembered. One priest wrote a chilling note before resigning. "He carries too many memories in one face. If people look at him long enough, they begin to see themselves in him." Another added, "We do not fear who he will become. We fear who he has already been." These vague, unsettling statements revealed a deeper terror, that Jonas was not a single person, but a condensation of forgotten lives, repressed identities, or unresolved trauma embedded in the institutions that created and destroyed countless enslaved children. Whether this fear was rational or not, it drove the seminary to a desperate conclusion. Jonas had to be erased again, but someone else reached him first. The night before Jonas's scheduled transfer, an unexplained silence fell over Court Square. Dogs stopped barking. Horses refused to move. The riverboats sounded no whistles. Even the insects ceased their nighttime hum. Guards reported an overwhelming pressure in their ears, like the air itself had thickened. At 2:14 a.m., every lantern in the holding yard extinguished simultaneously. At 2:15 a.m., Jonas vanished again. This time his shackles remained locked. Their keys still hung on the guard's belt. One guard later told his wife that he had seen a figure standing beside Jonas, a small figure, a child holding his hand. The guard swore the child had no face, not mute. He died by suicide a week later. His final sentence scrawled on the wall, "We are the ones who took their faces. Now they take ours." Investigators dismissed the event as guilt-induced hysteria. But the next morning, the seminary received a letter in unsteady handwriting. "He is going back to the only place he was ever known. Do not follow." The letter bore no signature, but its ink matched the ink found in the orphanage's hidden room. A search party followed tracks leading from the city into the nearby pine woods. The forest had long been rumored to hide the graves of unregistered children, those who died during the memory correction trials. In the woods, the search party found a strange pattern: footprints belonging to Jonas, and beside them, footprints belonging to a much smaller individual. But each time the path narrowed between trees, the smaller footprints disappeared, only to reappear several yards ahead, as though the child moved in impossible ways through gaps too small for a human body. The search party grew uneasy. One man remarked that the woods felt too quiet, like a church before a storm. Another reported seeing fleeting shapes behind the trees, always at the edge of vision. Then they found the clearing. At its center was a small mound of earth, a child's grave. No marker, no name, only the number 1481 carved into a decaying wooden post. Fresh dirt indicated someone had visited the grave recently, and then they saw something else. A second mound of earth beside the first, still open. As if it was waiting, as if it was prepared, but no body lay inside, only a single chain, coiled like a discarded memory. When news of the graves reached Memphis officials, the seminary intervened immediately, ordering all search parties to halt and forbidding further inquiry. They claimed the numbers were part of an old, irrelevant coding system, but clergy correspondence revealed a more sinister truth. The number 1481 had been reserved for children who failed memory correction. These children were isolated, stripped of identity, subjected to attempts at personality reconstruction, and if they continued to resist, quietly removed from records. In other words, children who remembered too much. A letter from 1840 stated, "One among the 1480 series refuses to forget. He repeats the names of the others. P triggers remembrance in the corrected children. We cannot permit this." Historians concluded chillingly that Jonas resembled one of these children, even though decades had passed. But children from the 1480 series would have been middle-aged or elderly by 1851, unless they had died young, unless the seminary's fear was not that Jonas had grown, but that he had not grown at all. Church leaders ordered the graves destroyed and the woods cleared, but workers refused. Many claimed they could hear whispering voices near the mounds, calling them by childhood nicknames no one else knew. One worker tore off his gloves and fled, screaming, "I can't bury myself again." Inside the seminary's archives, hidden beneath years of dust, investigators found one confession written in a trembling hand. No name, no date, only this heading: "Confession concerning 1481." The writer claimed to be one of the clergy who oversaw the orphanage program. He described one child in particular: silent, watchful, incapable of forgetting, a child who remembered his original family name, despite months of forced identity correction. He wrote, "I lied when I said he was stubborn. He was not stubborn. He was aware. He looked at me with a gaze that carried every memory of every other child I had ever condemned." The confession then shifted to terror. When the children saw him, they remembered their own names again. They remembered everything. We had to separate him. Then, I was the one who erased his number. I thought I was saving him, but I condemned him to wander without origin, without history, without self. Finally, the confession ended with a horrifying line. He was the only one we could not kill because he would not die. Researchers initially dismissed this as metaphor until forensic reports determined the newly disturbed grave in the pine woods held no human remains at all. It was empty. Just like the erased line in the orphanage registry. Just like the gap in the seminary's ledger. Just like Jonas's entire identity. Attempts to trace Jonas's origin failed. No plantation listed him. No ship manifest recorded him. No census noted his existence. He appeared from nowhere, fully grown, with no scars of labor, no dialect patterns, no physical markers of long-term hardship. But there was one clue, a note scribbled in the margin of a plantation. Account book from Louisiana received a child with no past, returned a man with too many. This suggested Jonas had been part of a rotation system, transferred between plantations and institutions, identities rewritten to break ties to family and place. But Jonas did not break. Instead, he accumulated. A folklorist studying the case suggested. Jonas represented embodied memory, a person who had absorbed the identities of other children erased by the system. Not a supernatural entity, but a living repository of trauma. No institution could whitewash this. Would explain why adults from different decades recognized him. He carried the echoes of the children they once encountered. It also explained why children cried when they saw him. He reminded them of their own lost identities. But it did not explain the most chilling detail. His face never changed. Not across decades. Not across testimonies. Not across impossible timelines. If Jonas had lived a normal lifespan, someone would have documented signs of aging, but every account insisted he looked exactly the same at each appearance, as though time refused to lay claim to him. 3 days after his disappearance from the holding yard, a farmer outside Memphis reported seeing a tall figure walking beside a child across a cotton field just past dawn. He described the man first. Calm, barefoot, chain still clasped around his wrists, though broken in the center. Then the child, short, frail, completely silent. The farmer called out, asking if they needed help. The child turned. The farmer later insisted it had no face, just smooth skin where eyes, nose, and mouth should be. Investigators dismissed this as hallucination, induced by early morning fog, but the farmer's wife confirmed his story. She said the faceless child raised its hand and pointed toward the horizon, where the trees swallowed the path into the orphanage woods. The man Jonas placed a hand on the child's shoulder and walked with him until both figures dissolved into the mist. Search teams found no tracks, no disturbance in the deep, no fibers, blood, or broken chains. But they did find one thing, carved into a tree at the edge of the field, fresh and deep. "Remember me." Following these events, something strange unfolded throughout Memphis. Dozens of people who had been present at the original auction reported gaps in memory, entire days missing. Some forgot family names. Others forgot street names they had known since childhood. One woman forgot the face of her own son. Doctors blamed cholera after. Ministers blamed spiritual corruption. But a pattern emerged. Every person who experienced memory collapse had made eye contact with Jonas. One witness, a banker's apprentice, described the sensation when I looked at him. I felt like he knew me better than I knew myself, like he had lived my entire childhood with me. Another claimed I saw my mother's face reflected in his eyes, but she died when I was 3. This suggested Jonas did not simply carry memories, he reflected them back. He was a mirror held up to a society desperate to forget the lives it had erased. Church leaders panicked. They issued strict orders forbidding discussion of the event. They burned documents. They sealed seminary wings. They removed headstones from the pine woods graves. But memory is not so easily destroyed, especially memory that refuses to die. And Jonas, whatever he was memory made flesh. Over the next 6 months, Memphis enacted one of the largest quiet cover-ups in its history. Newspaper archives from the period show conspicuous omissions. No mention of the auction, no mention of the drowned clerk, no mention of the seminary resignations, no mention of the missing child, no mention of Jonas at all. Yet internal city records reveal frantic activity. Emergency council meetings confiscated church journals, payoffs to plantation owners, gag orders on witnesses, rapid demolition of the orphanage. The seminary burned its own confidential indices. A surviving letter from a deacon read, "We must bury the number 1481 forever. If he returns again, he will bring all the others with him." Even decades later, whenever someone tried to publish the story, authorities intervened. Manuscripts disappeared. Personal accounts were altered. Diaries were confiscated for archival preservation and never returned. It wasn't just embarrassment or guilt. It was fear. Fear that Jonas was not unique. Fear that others like him existed, children who had resisted erasure, surviving as living testaments to the lives institutions tried to blot out. If Jonas resurfaced, they believed he would awaken buried memories and others' memories capable of unraveling the machinery of their society. So the city buried every trace, or thought it did. In 1929, the seminary's oldest wing, long abandoned, was slated for demolition. A historian named Margaret Ellery requested access for research, suspecting the building contained records of the orphanage program inside. She found rot, dust, and remnants of religious instruction. But deeper inside the forbidden lower corridor, she uncovered something else. A locked steel file cabinet hidden behind layers of plaster. Inside it lay a torn ledger page, a key with the number 1481 engraved in, a journal written by a priest who seemed to be unraveling mentally. The ledger page listed children by number. Every line had personal details except one. Line 1481 contained only 4 words. Identity removed by order. The journal contained disturbing entries. He came back as a man. He knows every face I tried to erase. When I sleep, he stands at the foot of my bed and whispers the names of the children. I saw him again today. He has not aged. Ellery presented her findings, but the seminary board dismissed them as fabrications. Days later, the journal vanished. But not before Ellery copied the most chilling passage where it did not teach him to remember. We taught him to collect. Modern scholars examining the case developed a theory known as the collector-child hypothesis. It proposes Jonas was one of the orphanage's earliest victims of identity erasure. But unlike the others, he did not lose memory, he gained them. Instead of suppressing trauma, his mind collected it. Instead of forgetting identities, he absorbed them. Instead of breaking under psychological pressure, he fused with the identities of the other children. This would explain the recognition adults felt, the fear clergy expressed, the faceless child sightings, the unaging appearance, the vanishing and reappearing, his connection to grave 1481, and the mass amnesia around him. But the theory's final implication is the darkest. A child robbed of his identity becomes a vessel for the unremembered dead. And when that child grows into adulthood, he becomes a walking monument to every erased life, a threat to any institution. Built on forgetting. Jonas was not supernatural. He was not immortal. He was not a mythic figure. He was the physical, the embodiment of the past that the city of Memphis tried to destroy, a past that came walking back into the auction yard, past that would not die. The last confirmed sighting of Jonas occurred at dusk near the pine woods. A seamstress heard what she described as 2 voices speaking without sound, a man's and a child's echoing from the tree line. When she approached, she saw Jonas standing beside the faceless child. This time, the child's face was not blank, it was shifting, flickering through countless expressions, as though struggling to recall one final identity. Jonas looked at her, not pleading, not warning, but with profound sorrow. He then placed his hand on the child's back. The child nodded, and together they stepped into the woods. Neither was ever seen again. The following morning, workers found the 2 graves, 1481 and the empty one, both filled and sealed. The earth packed tight. Laid on top of them was a single wooden sign. They remember. Over time, the woods were cleared. The seminary was demolished. The orphanage records disappeared. The city grew over its own buried history. But the legend persists. They say memory does not vanish. It waits. It accumulates. It gathers strength in silence. And sometimes, when the world tries too hard to forget the lives it destroyed, memory returns, not as a ghost, not as a myth, but as a man with a face you cannot quite place. A man who looks at you as though he has known you since childhood. A man who brings with him every story you tried to bury. A man like Jonas, a man who was never meant to exist.